Bring your bathing suits, and don't forget your boots and coats. Folks, we guarantee the show that we perform is never dull. If there's a lull, it's just a call before the storm. Action change, rising cold, so warm. And rearrange the sunny days to crazy storm. The curtains rocking with the black and every year. Come see a new show daily in the atmosphere. Introducing Dr.
So today we're going to be talking about weather. Please write in your table of contents, weather, chapter 7, and then go to the page in your journal that you'll be writing those notes. Weather is the greatest show on earth. Pause whenever you need to as we go through our notes today. Let's begin with the term air pressure. So air pressure is measured with a barometer. There is low air pressure, which brings warmer temperatures and rainy or snowy weather, depending upon the upon the temperatures. Or there could be high pressure, which brings cooler temperatures or fair or pretty weather. This is an example of what a barometer looks like. Pause when you need to. Moving on, what is an air mass? So an air mass is a large body of air that has similar properties. Think of a mass of something. Well, this is a mass of air. Air masses can move and they can also be tracked. That's what our weather forecasters use to be able to tell what weather we might be having in the upcoming future. This also provides clues to any future weather that we might have. For instance, cold air masses versus warm air masses, wet versus dry air masses. Again, here's a barometer and examples of cold or wet or warm or dry air masses. What is a front? A front is a boundary where two air masses would meet. Air masses don't mix together because their properties are different. For instance, different temperatures, a cold air mass and a warm air mass don't meet, and the same with moistures, different amounts of moisture. A wet air mass versus a dry air mass don't mix together. Fronts are named by the temperature of the air that is leading the way. For instance, if the cold air is moving towards a warm air, then we call that a cold front. If a warm air mass is moving towards an area, we call that a warm front. So let's learn a little bit about fronts.
Here at the Weather Channel, we talk about fronts all the time. Cold fronts bringing in cold air, warm fronts bringing in warm air. But these are 3D invisible features in the atmosphere. They're really hard to get your head around. So what are they really? Well, a cold front is actually the border of two different air masses. When it moves on in, the cold air goes underneath the warm air. It's heavier, it's more dense, so it sinks. Warm air, on the other hand, is lighter, and so it rises up above. Still, hard to see that in the clear sky and the clear air, so we have a little bit of a substitution. See, air is a fluid just like water, and we get to use food coloring in water to help make this a little bit more visible. In this glass, we've got cold water, conveniently colored blue. In this glass, warm water colored red. Now, I'm not going to lie, this is a bit of a messy situation, so if you're doing this at home, it helps to have a towel nearby. So cover up the warm red water, flip it upside down, and put it directly onto the cold glass. You separate the two, and, well, basically, we've created a front. We now have the separation of the warm water on top and the cold water on the bottom. I know it's not very impressive yet because that's how it started, right? It becomes more impressive when we move it onto its side. Just like when a cold front comes in, the hot water stays on the top of the atmosphere, cold water down at the bottom, and the purple that you see is the actual front separating the two different air masses. So convenient when it's in water, not so convenient in the air, but it still works exactly the same way.
So let's talk about what a cold front is. So what is a cold front? A cold front is a cold air mass that moves toward a warmer air mass. And if you'll see the direction of movement there in the two pictures, you'll notice that the cold air is moving on to where the warm air is. Remember, the warm air rises up then, and then we will see at that point that the cool air sinks below, the warm air rises up. Notice the symbol for the cold front. Also notice what occurs when those two join or meet together. Remember, fronts don't like to, air masses don't mix, so we end up with a boundary or the front itself. And at that point, we will notice that a rain or some type of thunderstorms will occur. Remember also, as the warm air rises, remember it evaporates as it's going up. It condensates into clouds in the sky, and then we see that precipitation. Let's move on and watch a video about cold fronts.
But first, of course, we have to learn something, and to do so in the weather, we turn to Scott and his Weather Whiz Kids.
Yeah, well, it's the kids that ask the great questions,
Right.
and I just scramble and I talk to other kids to get the answers. No, not that part, but we actually share some good information. I went to Eagle Middle School this past week. I'm going to go back again in April, talk to some of the other kids as well. Had some great questions, and here's a great question, and I'll have an explanation of why this question is being asked.
My name is Taylor Aaron, and I go to Eagle Middle School, and my weather question is, how does a cold front bring thunderstorms and clear weather?
Taylor, great question. What Taylor was meaning is, as she was doing research on cold fronts, she would see some books say that cold fronts bring precipitation with it, and then other research saying cold fronts bring clear weather. She was a little confused on how exactly does that work. Well, what it's talking about is depending on what part of the cold front and what's the overall forecast after a cold front passes. So here's what a cold front looks like, a cross-section. If you were to slice the atmosphere, there's the blue line I was showing you earlier today, the cold front coming on through, and as these track to the east, or whatever direction they're heading in, behind it there's drier weather. But because it's cold air that's coming in, cold air is heavier and denser, and so it stays close to the ground. As it does, the warm air out ahead of it, like we had today, rises. And that rising air cools and condenses and makes clouds and precipitation. So we have lots of showers today and even some thunderstorms because the air rises rapidly and violently just ahead of the cold front. So we had thunderstorms and thunderheads developing just like this. But once the cold front passes, the air is sinking. You see these arrows here. That air is sinking and it tends to dry out. So fronts will bring precipitation with them, but they also bring the promise of clearing skies behind, and that's exactly what we're seeing tonight. We have the showers and precipitation. It is all moving to the east, and now we are drying out as that cold weather moves right back in. So, guys, this was a great question and a great answer, and it was timely. I kind of thought we would have a front coming through tonight, so we timed that question for tonight to show you that this is pretty much what's happening right now. The dry air's coming on in.
They watched your extended forecast. They knew it was coming too.
So let's go back to our notes and discuss what is a warm front. So a warm front is a warm air mass which moves into a cold air mass. As you're looking at the picture that you see there, notice the arrow of the direction of the movement, and then notice that the warm front, and that's why the symbol is there, shows the warm air moving towards the cold air. That cold air is sitting there on the ground, and the warm front hits it, Remember, it rises up, warm air will rise, the water in that air will evaporate, and then as it gets up higher, it gets cold, it condensates, it makes a cloud, and then that cloud will begin some type of precipitation. So the cold air stays below the warm air as the warm air rises over it. And then we see a slower movement of the weather, which is not as volatile or as eye-catching as a thunderstorm. The warm front coming in will bring showers, typically rain showers of some sort. So I'd like us to go on and learn a little bit about a warm front.
Oh no.
Cold fronts versus warm fronts. Now, initially, the reason why they're called fronts in the first place is because of World War I, when the Norwegian meteorologists were watching the way that air masses were reacting, was similar to the fact that when two armies came at each other, that was called the battlefront. And what was left behind was a pretty violent act. Well, the same thing was true between air. When two different temperature airs were colliding, some pretty violent weather was occurring. Now, you name a front based on the air mass that's moving faster and overtakes the other one. So in the top here, we see cold front. And the reason why it's a cold front is because the cold air is catching up with the warm air. And then at the bottom here, you see warm front. And that's when warm air is moving faster and overtaking the cold air. Let's take a look at the cold front first. You can see the cold front line is sloped downwards. And also you have cumulonimbus clouds, pretty large, tall clouds forming here. And the distance across the bottom flowing from west to east is only 500 kilometers. Now that's not to be a specific number every time, but it's just going to be used for comparison later on. Now, this cold air comes in, and because it's dense, it will sink. That means this warm air that's already over here needs to be pushed upwards as this cold air basically plows its way in. So these changes are rather abrupt and quite violent in the terms of weather. If you were standing down here on the surface and this was coming towards you, the changes would be pretty quick, but also over pretty quick. So that's where pretty powerful storms can occur, is when cold air is rushing in towards warm air. Now, a warm front does still bring some weather along with it, but you can see that this slope here, this line, is a little bit more gradual. And so the changes aren't as dramatic, but it still brings in weather. And instead of plowing its way through, because warm air is less dense, it will just kind of slide over this cold air. Now, if you were a person standing on the surface here, the first thing you would see as a sign that weather was coming your way was up here, you would see some high-flying clouds. But then gradually, as that storm moved closer to you, you're going to start to see the clouds get lower and lower to the ground, and rain's being pulled along with it. So earlier I mentioned the 500 kilometers on the cold front. Now comparing that to the 1,000 kilometers as a reference number for the warm front.
So we learned in our video that a warm front is when the warm air approaches the cold air, and it's a much slower rain shower system that will occur.
Oh no.
That's all, folks.
Today you've learned a lot of information about air masses, fronts. You've learned about cold fronts and warm fronts. I'd like you to close this now and take the exit ticket that is included on your Canvas lesson for today. Make it a great day. The choice is yours.
That's all, folks.